dismissed the murder charge. But he found her guilty of manslaughter and sentenced her to 20 years in prison.
A high chair, strips of silvery tape, silence. The medical examiner's voice is clinical as she reads the word that changes everything: asphyxia. 5-year-old Logan Marr dies in a foster home in Chelsea, Maine in January 2001. The woman responsible isn't a stranger pulled from the streets. She's a former caseworker for the Maine Department of Human Services, the very system that approved her as a foster parent. The irony is suffocating. The woman who once investigated abuse complaints now stands accused of the ultimate betrayal. Sally Schofield knows the rules because she helped write them. In public, she presents as the competent professional who understands child welfare from the inside. She speaks the language of best practices and child-centered planning. She knows what inspectors look for because she was once an inspector herself. In private, she uses duct tape to silence and immobilize a frightened child. The scope is devastating in its intimacy. One victim, one household, 1 year that ends in death. The case becomes notorious not just because a child died, but because expertise became a weapon, because the system licensed someone who knew exactly how to game oversight, and because it forced Maine to confront an uncomfortable truth about conflicts of interest in foster care. Schofield was born in the mid-20th century in the United States. Biographical details remain sparse in public records because attention centers on her institutional role rather than her personal history. She worked for years as a child protection caseworker in Maine, investigating allegations of abuse and neglect, making recommendations about child removals and placements. That experience should have made her a model caregiver. Instead, it gave her insider knowledge about how to avoid scrutiny. The relevant childhood belongs to Logan, born in 1995, removed from her biological mother during a protection case, shuffled through temporary placements before landing in Schofield's Chelsea home. Early warning signs emerge during supervised visits when the 5-year-old voices fear about returning to the Schofield home. She tells caseworkers she doesn't want to go back. She describes being taped to a chair. These concerns are documented, but not acted upon with sufficient urgency. The path to this crime is bureaucratic: a foster license granted to a former insider, oversight that grows informal because colleagues assume a former caseworker knows what she's doing, and a child who enters a house where discipline looks like immobilization. The formative moment is the normalization of restraint. Once tape is used without immediate consequence, it becomes habit, then routine, then lethal. From 2000 into early 2001, the pattern escalates in frequency and duration. Logan is 5 years old when Sally Schofield begins using duct tape to bind her to a high chair and cover her mouth. Confirmed victims, 1. Suspected, none, though questions linger about whether previous foster children in Schofield's care experienced similar treatment. The method is restraint leading to oxygen deprivation. The modus operandi is control disguised as behavior management. Schofield later claims she was trying to prevent Logan from hurting herself or destroying property. There is no serial evolution here in the traditional sense, just repetition and escalation until the lethal event. On January 31st, 2001, Logan dies. The configuration of the tape is not incidental. It covers her mouth and nose, impeding breathing. Investigators later determined that the child was bound in this manner for extended periods, sometimes hours. The room holds evidence in plain sight: rolls of duct tape, the high chair with residue, marks on Logan's small body. Schofield's immediate reaction is to claim accident, to say she didn't intend harm, to insist she was only trying to keep the child safe. The most disturbing aspect is categorical. A state-approved caregiver using explicitly prohibited restraint techniques while the state's own proximity to the case, Schofield's former colleagues were now her licensing and oversight contacts, creates blind spots in scrutiny. The familiarity bred not contempt but dangerous deference. Investigators follow the science with meticulous care. Autopsy findings contradict the accidental narrative at every turn. The scene tells a story that cannot be ignored. Duct tape residue on Logan's face, ligature marks on her wrists and ankles, positioning inconsistent with self-application, and occluded airway. The medical examiner documents asphyxia as the cause of death. Forensic pathologists explain that the tape configuration prevented adequate breathing and that the duration of restraint was sufficient to cause death. Together, the evidence forms a coherent picture of lethal restraint dressed up as discipline. The breakthrough is both simple and devastating. Duct tape plus a 5-year-old child plus extended time equals asphyxia. No other explanation fits the facts. Police arrest Schofield in February 2001. Her reaction during interrogation is controlled, procedural, utterly unpersuasive against the forensics. She maintains she never meant to hurt Logan, that she was overwhelmed, that she didn't know the restraint could be fatal. Prosecutors don't buy it. Neither does the medical evidence. The trial unfolds in 2002 in a main courtroom that becomes the focus of statewide attention. Prosecutors charge both murder and manslaughter, giving the jury options. The state presents medical testimony, photographs of Logan's small body, expert witnesses on child development and safe restraint practices. The defense argues lack of intent, argues that Schofield was a dedicated caregiver pushed beyond her limits, argues that Logan's behavior problems necessitated intervention. The jury convicts on manslaughter rather than murder, finding that while Schofield caused the death, the state did not prove premeditated intent to kill. There are no theatrics to redeem the act, no mitigating disclosures that alter the fundamentals of a child dying alone while taped to furniture. The court sentences Schofield to 17 to 20 years in prison. One court observer later notes in testimony during policy hearings, the child welfare system failed Logan Marr in every possible way. The statement becomes a rallying cry for reform. Schofield serves most of that term in the Maine Correctional Center for Women. On April 25, 2017, after serving approximately 16 years, she exits Maine's prison system to probation supervision. The release is quiet, without fanfare. The cultural legacy is not a film about the killer, it's a documentary record about the child. PBS Frontline produces extensive reporting on the case. Maine legislators push toward kinship placement priority, clearer restraint ban policies written into law, and conflict of interest rules that prevent former child welfare workers from becoming foster parents without additional scrutiny. The name that endures in Maine's collective memory is Logan's, not Schofield's. A small memorial garden is planted in Chelsea. Advocates use Logan's case as Exhibit A in arguments for unannounced home visits and lower caseloads. Do systems create offenders or merely license them? Here, knowledge of policy did not civilize conduct. It concealed it. When an insider chooses cruelty, only external checks protect a child. The question haunts Maine's child welfare apparatus to this day. How many other Logan Marrs are out there, silenced by people who know exactly which boxes to check? We move from a so-called tragic accident in Maine to a staged abduction in Ohio, where grief becomes performance art and the child dies alone in suffocating August heat.
Liz Carroll and her husband, David Carroll, know what they face and why. Unfortunately, it's not so simple for their young children.
A green park in suburban Cincinnati, a bank of microphones, television cameras from every local station. I need help from the public to help find my son. Please, please return him to a hospital, says Elizabeth Carroll, voice breaking for the cameras, tears streaming down her face. The plea is theatre of the cruelest kind. 3-year-old Marcus Fiesel is already dead, has been dead for days. Search teams fan out across Claremont County. Volunteers distribute missing child flyers. Police organize grid searches. Meanwhile, miles away, a closet in the Carrolls' rented house sits sealed, having baked in the summer sun for an entire weekend while the couple attended a family reunion in Kentucky. Elizabeth Liz Carroll and David Carroll Jr. look the part of stable, caring foster parents, exactly the kind any county might thank for taking in high-needs children. They speak confidently to the media. Liz is articulate, emotional, desperate for her foster son's safe return. David stands supportive at her side. In public, they are camera-comfortable, grief-stricken, models of concern. In private, they have tied and abandoned a developmentally disabled 3-year-old over a long weekend to attend a family event without the inconvenience of arranging childcare. Scope: 1 child, Claremont County, Ohio, August 2006. Notoriety: a televised missing child hoax that mobilizes an entire community, and a courtroom reconstruction that exposes calibrated deception on a national scale, eventually featured on 48 Hours and investigated by NBC's Dateline. Their personal backstories matter less than the structural pipeline that brought Marcus into their home. Referral through a carefree place, a private for-profit placement agency contracted by the county, routine home studies that missed red flags about household dynamics, and David Carroll's adult son from a previous relationship living in the home, and the speed with which high-need children are placed when beds are scarce. Early signs include rigid discipline practices that neighbors occasionally witness, unusual secrecy around caregiving routines, and Marcus's visible fear during some interactions. The path to the crime is logistical and chillingly cold. A family reunion looms in Kentucky. Marcus is difficult. He has autism. He requires constant supervision. He doesn't communicate verbally in typical ways. Respite care is unavailable on short notice. The solution becomes restraint in a bedroom closet. The formative moment is the first time the closet door shuts on a bound child and nothing bad seems to happen to the adults. That false lesson that they can get away with it sets up the fatal weekend. It's a calculation. A few days, what could happen? The crimes run with terrible precision and planning. Confirmed victims, 1. Suspected, none. Though investigators later question whether Marcus experienced prior restraint incidents that didn't prove fatal. On or about August 4th through August 6, 2006, Marcus Fiesel is bound with packing tape and wrapped in a blanket. Testimony will later describe him mummified. Then locked in an upstairs bedroom closet during one of the hottest weekends of the summer. The house has no air conditioning. The closet has no ventilation. Hypothermia follows over hours, then death. The child dies alone, unable to escape, unable to call for help, while his foster parents enjoy a family barbecue 70 miles away in Kentucky. Method: non-violent on the surface, lethally indifferent underneath. Modus operandi: immobilization, concealment, then performance. Pattern: the public script continues even after the death. Press conferences, tears, the carefully crafted story of a child who wandered away at a Claremont County park. Liz Carroll tells reporters Marcus has autism and might not respond to his name if strangers approach. She begs for his safe return. She appears on multiple newscasts. Notable victim details matter. Marcus has developmental delays and autism. He is 3 years old, small, vulnerable, and the perfect subject for a plausibly wandering child narrative. Evasion is proactive rather than reactive, disposing of Marcus's body in the Great Miami River and crafting a narrative that mobilizes the community as unwitting cover. Volunteers search for a child whose caregivers have already burned his remains and scattered them. The most disturbing element is the exploitation of civic empathy. Neighbors organize search parties for a child they have no chance of finding. The community's grief and concern become props in the Carroll's performance. Detectives pivot from the park to the timeline when witness statements don't align. Surveillance footage from the park shows no child matching Marcus's description. Witness accounts from neighbors place Marcus at the Carroll home on dates when he was supposedly missing. Calendar analysis exposes gaps. The Carrolls were in Kentucky during the critical window. Grand jury testimony begins to crack the facade when family members describe the reunion and investigators realize Marcus never made the trip. A breakthrough arrives when inconsistencies multiply and David Carroll's adult son, under pressure, changes his story. The disposal site is eventually located on the Carroll property. burn marks, bone fragments, evidence of hasty cremation. Arrests follow within weeks of Marcus's reported disappearance. The hoax collapses under the weight of forensic detail, timeline reconstruction, and conflicting statements that no longer hold together. Trials in 2007 deliver clarity and consequence. Liz Carroll stands trial and is convicted of multiple charges including murder, kidnapping, and gross abuse of a corpse. The jury hears medical testimony about hypothermia, sees photographs of the closet, listens to forensic experts explain how long a small child would survive in those conditions. The verdict is guilty on all counts. The court sentences her to 54 years to life. David Carroll pleads guilty before trial to murder, kidnapping, and gross abuse of a corpse, avoiding the spectacle but accepting responsibility. His sentence is 15 years to life. A notable line from the state's closing argument lingers in court transcripts and media coverage. They treated this child with less care than one would give a pet. The prosecutor points out that the Carrolls wouldn't have locked a dog in a closet for 3 days in August heat. The verdicts turn the press conference performance into evidence of calculated deceit, sociopathy dressed in suburban normalcy. Both serve their terms in Ohio's correctional system. Parole boards revisit their cases, deny release, and schedule hearings again. As of November 2025, both Elizabeth Carroll and David Carroll Jr. remain incarcerated. Liz Carroll's earliest parole eligibility passed without approval. David Carroll's case is reviewed periodically with no release granted. The cultural legacy is grim pedagogy for law enforcement, child welfare workers, and the public. Missing child alerts can be hoaxes designed to cover crimes. Investigators must watch timelines more carefully than tears. Placement agencies must vet households with unannounced visits and must have protocols for conflict of interest red flags when adult relatives move into foster homes. What is the line between stress and cruelty? Every caregiver faces strain. Most ask for help, call for respite, admit they're overwhelmed. Here, 2 adults turned exhaustion into abandonment and then built a media spectacle on top of a corpse. The question haunts, was it panic or premeditation? The answer, delivered in court through evidence and testimony, is both. The decision to restrain Marcus was premeditated. They planned the trip, knew he couldn't come, chose restraint over respite. The decision to lie was panic transformed into performance. We shift to Central Texas, where a foster mother says a toddler's catastrophic injuries happened during play. But the medical imaging tells a story of violence no play could produce.
The foster mother is charged with murdering her 2-year-old little girl, Alexandria.
You know, it's just hard to imagine how anybody...
An affidavit is a document without emotion. It records facts in neutral language required by law. Lost her temper and slammed her head first into a floor. The words are stark, black ink on white paper. A 2-year-old named Alexandria Hill, called Alex by those who knew her, enters foster care in Milam County, Texas, under the license of Texas Mentor, a private contractor hired to provide foster placements. Within months of placement, she is dying in a hospital in July 2013. Brain swelling is catastrophic, the kind neurosurgeons recognize as unsurvivable. Retinal hemorrhages bloom across imaging scans like terrible flowers. Subdural blood appears dark on CT scans. Pediatric specialists recognize the pattern immediately. This is not an accident, not a fall from playground equipment, not a tumble downstairs. This is traumatic brain injury consistent with violent impact. Cheryl Ann Small's public profile is minimal, a licensed non-kinship caregiver approved by Texas Mentor to provide foster services in rural Central Texas. She passes background checks. Her home study is acceptable. On paper, she looks like part of the solution to Texas's chronic shortage of foster beds. In private, she loses control in a way that proves fatal for a toddler who cannot protect herself. Scope: 1 child, Milam County, Central Texas, 2013. Notoriety. The case becomes a reference point in debates over privatized foster care oversight, contractor accountability, and the consequences of for-profit foster placement systems that prioritize bed counts over safety metrics. Biographical specifics on Small's early life are sparse in official reporting. Media coverage focuses on the crime and the systemic failures rather than the perpetrator's backstory. The relevant history pertains to the contractor and placement system. Texas Mentor, operating under state contracts, had received citations and documented deficiencies in multiple facilities before Alex's placement. Records show inspection violations, staffing concerns, and oversight gaps. Early warnings about the Small home specifically include prior complaints from sources that remain sealed in child welfare records and concerns that do not halt the placement or trigger additional monitoring. The path is case management under extreme pressure. A child removed from one dangerous environment for valid protective reasons is placed into another where the paperwork appears complete, but the risk assessment is inadequate, cursory, or simply ignored in the rush to find a bed. The key moments are invisible until too late. Rising frustration in the household, inadequate support from the contractor, and a toddler who cannot articulate fear or defend herself from an adult twice her size. The crime window is brief and final. Confirmed victims, 1. Suspected, none. Though questions always linger in these cases about whether prior incidents occurred but didn't result in visible injury severe enough to trigger intervention. Method: blunt force head trauma. Modus operandi: an impulsive, violent impact during a moment of rage, later explained to first responders and investigators as accidental or occurring during normal play. Pattern in the immediate aftermath: minimization in initial statements to authorities, shifting explanations that don't align with medical facts, and attempts to frame the injury as an unfortunate accident rather than an assault. The evolution is not serial but escalatory in a single moment. The difference between irritation and lethal force is measured in seconds and the proximity of a hard surface like a floor or wall. Notable medical details matter critically to the case. Imaging reveals subdural and subarachnoid hemorrhage indicating severe trauma, retinal bleeding in both eyes consistent with violent shaking or impact, and skull fractures inconsistent with household accidents. Pediatric abuse specialists, called in by hospital staff who recognize the injury pattern, document findings utterly inconsistent with a minor fall, a stumble, or normal play between a caregiver and a 2-year-old. The most disturbing aspect is systemic rather than individual. A toddler removed by Child Protective Services for her own safety dies because the replacement home, approved and monitored through a private contractor operating under state authority, was not safe. The very system designed to protect her delivered her to danger. Investigators anchor their case in medicine and follow the evidence where it leads. Pediatric specialists provide testimony and reports that are careful, precise, and damning in their conclusions. The breakthrough is Cheryl Ann Small's own admission during police questioning that she lost her temper with Alex over a behavioral issue. The phrase becomes evidence of state of mind, proof that this was not an accident, but a reaction to frustration. The medical impossibility of the injuries occurring as Small initially described seals the case. Police arrest her in July 2013 on a capital murder charge in Texas, causing the death of a child under 10 years old during the commission of another felony, such as assault qualifies as capital murder, making the defendant eligible for the death penalty or life without parole. In 2014, a Texas jury in Milam County convicts Cheryl Ann Small of capital murder. The trial includes testimony from medical examiners, pediatric specialists, and investigators who walked jurors through the timeline and the medical impossibilities of Small's explanations. The courtroom tone is clinical. The science speaks loudest. The child's injuries leave no room for alternative narratives or reasonable doubt. The jury deliberates and returns a guilty verdict. The sentence is life in prison without the possibility of parole, the mandatory sentence for capital murder when the death penalty is not imposed. Appeals are filed through the standard process and denied at multiple levels. 2 years later, in September 2016, Cheryl Ann Small dies in prison of natural causes at age 53, having served less than 3 years of her life sentence. The legacy is found in policy discussions and legislative hearings rather than popular media dramatization. Contractor oversight protocols strengthened in the wake of Alex's death, deficiency follow-up requirements that mandate state intervention when contractors accumulate violations, and mandatory reporting escalation procedures when concerns are raised about specific placements. The philosophical question is almost unbearable in its simplicity. What did safety mean in the paperwork that moved Alex from her biological home into Cheryl Small's house? When does bureaucratic compliance, checking boxes, filing reports, meeting minimum standards, become bureaucratic negligence that costs lives? We leave Texas for Queensland, Australia, where a 12-year-old's body washes up on a riverbank and a foster father's desperate need to protect his son from incest charges drives him to murder.
Rick Forbin was one of 4 people taken into custody this morning. 2 other men.
A coroner's report. A single clinical line that changes everything. Deliberate choking or asphyxiation. The victim is 12-year-old Tia Palmer, last seen alive on October 30th, 2015, in the Logan area of southeast Queensland. Her body is discovered on the banks of the Pimpama River on November 5, 2015, 6 days after she was reported missing. The man wearing the caregiver badge, approved, licensed, trusted by Queensland's child protection system, is also the man who ensures the child never speaks about what happened with his teenage son. His name is Rick John Forbin. In 2018, he pleads guilty to murder, avoiding a trial that would have exposed every sordid detail. In April 2025, he is found dead in his prison cell at Woolston Correctional Centre. Rick John Forbin presents to the outside world as an ordinary community dad who runs a small home-based carpet cleaning business and helps care for at-risk youth through the foster system. Neighbors describe him as friendly, hard-working, a family man. In private, he is a calculator of risks, a manipulator of narratives, and a protector of family secrets at any cost, even the cost of a child's life. Scope: 1 child, 2015, Southeast Queensland, Australia. Notoriety: the murder unfolds alongside criminal charges against multiple family members for perjury, acting as accessories after the fact, and incest, revealing a household conspiracy to protect Forbin's son after an incest disclosure threatened the family's carefully constructed facade and Rick's business reputation. Forbin's early life and background are not the central point of the case. His family's internal economy of secrets is what matters. He is married to Julene Forbin. They have 2 sons, Trent, the eldest, and Joshua. The crucial pre-crime moment is disclosure. Tia Palmer confides to a school counselor about sexual contact with Trent Forbin, who is significantly older than her. The information circulates within the household. The family faces a choice: report the abuse, protect Tia, and face consequences for Trent, or silence the problem. Early warning signs exist only in retrospect for investigators. Sudden attempts to control Tia movements and communications, increased household secrecy that neighbors later recall, and the construction of a missing child narrative designed to buy time and misdirect the investigation. The path to murder is paved with self-preservation. Rick decides that Tia Lake's testimony cannot be allowed, that protecting Trent is paramount, that a 12-year-old's life is expendable. The crime is efficient, intimate, and cold. Confirmed victims: 1. Method: asphyxiation, likely manual strangulation or choking based on autopsy findings. Modus operandi: silence the witness, dispose of the body in water to complicate forensic investigation, and continue the performance of the distraught foster father searching for a missing child. Pattern across the household: coordinated lying. Rick's wife Julene and his sons Trent and Joshua all commit perjury during the investigation to keep the full story intact. Trent, who allegedly sexually abused Tia, is charged separately with incest and perjury. Julene and Joshua face perjury and accessory charges. Most disturbing aspect of the case: The motive is not rage, passion, or sadism. It is calculated cover-up of incest to protect family reputation, avoid legal consequences, and preserve Rick's foster care income stream and business relationships. The murder is pragmatic evil, a problem solved through killing. Investigators map contradictions across multiple family interviews and build a timeline that doesn't support the family's story. Physical evidence from the riverbank includes Tiale's body, which shows signs inconsistent with accidental drowning. Forensic analysis points toward homicide. Timeline reconstruction shows that Tiale could not have gone missing when and where the Thorburns claimed. The breakthrough is familial pressure. Once Trent Thorburn is charged with incest and perjury, the coordinated family story begins to fracture. Other relatives face perjury counts for lying to police. The weight of evidence and the fracturing conspiracy lead Rick Thorburn to accept that trial will expose everything. Faced with mounting evidence, forensic certainty, and the prospect of his family's secrets aired in open court, Rick Thorburn pleads guilty to murder in May 2018, avoiding a trial that would have been sensational and devastating. The Supreme Court of Queensland sentences him to life imprisonment with no parole eligibility for 20 years. In a victim impact statement read to the court, Tiale's biological mother, Cindy Palmer, describes the crime as evil beyond comprehension and says her daughter trusted the Thorburns to keep her safe. The statement is heartbreaking. On April 11, 2025, correctional officers conducting routine checks find Rick Thorburn dead in his cell at Woolston Correctional Centre near Brisbane. He was 61 years old. The death is not treated as suspicious. Authorities indicate no foul play. The most likely explanation, though not officially confirmed, is suicide or natural causes. The legacy is a set of uncomfortable questions Australian child protection officials continue to grapple with. How do you screen for households where multiple roles intersect? Foster care, home-based business, multiple adult family members? How adequate are conflict of interest protocols when financial incentives and caregiving authority mix? What happens when a foster carer's income depends on maintaining placements, creating perverse incentives to hide problems? Tiale's case prompts reviews and policy discussions, but the fundamental tension remains. Systems designed to protect children can become systems that conceal abuse when oversight is inadequate and when caregivers are motivated to hide rather than report. Which failure is worse? Not seeing the danger in the first place, or seeing it clearly and choosing to eliminate the witness who might speak? We move to New Zealand, where a single blow delivered in anger reduces a 3-year-old's world to agonizing minutes and prompts a nation to examine its child welfare practices. 10 years jail. The sentence lands in the High Court at Hamilton, New Zealand in 2003, while a Child, Youth and Family review is already underway into systemic failures. 3-year-old Tamati Pokaya is dead. The foster father, Michael Waterhouse, struck the boy in the abdomen after a minor conflict over food or behavior. The precise trigger is lost to the chaos of that day. The child bled internally, organs damaged by blunt force. Hours passed before medical attention was sought. By the time Tamati reached hospital, it was too late. The damage was irreversible. Michael Waterhouse appears ordinary to those who know him, a local caregiver in Huntly, a small town on New Zealand's North Island known for coal mining and a tight-knit community. He is not wealthy, not prominent, not anyone who would stand out. In private, he uses his fists when discipline crosses the line into violence. Scope: one child, 2002, into early 2003, Huntly and the Greater Waikato region, North Island, New Zealand. Notoriety: a manslaughter verdict that catalyzes public and governmental scrutiny of how child, youth and family vets and monitors foster placements, particularly around discipline practices, household stress indicators, and the adequacy of training provided to non-kinship caregivers taking high-need children. Biographical details on Waterhouse himself are sparse in public records and media coverage. The focus, appropriately, remains on the victim and the system. The relevant background is institutional. The CYF placement process that approved his home despite risk factors that should have triggered additional support or monitoring. Early warning signs, identified in retrospect during the review process, include strict discipline routines observed by neighbors and family members, and a household stress profile that should have prompted more frequent caseworker visits and respite services. The path to the crime is the most common and most tragic pattern in child welfare fatalities: short temper, small vulnerable child, disproportionate physical response to a trivial incident that in a healthy household would result in a timeout or calm conversation. The key formative moment is invisible, some internal breaking point where frustration overwhelms restraint and the fist becomes the answer. The crime itself is brutally brief, but its consequences are permanent. Confirmed victims: 1. Method: a punch or blow to the small abdomen of a 3-year-old, force sufficient to rupture internal organs and cause fatal internal bleeding. Modus operandi: physical punishment that escalates to fatal harm in a moment of rage. Pattern following the incident: denial of the severity, delay in seeking medical care that might have saved the child, and a cover story of accidental fall or household mishap that does not match the medical evidence once doctors examine the boy. The most disturbing aspect is velocity. How quickly a dispute over something as mundane as food becomes an irreversible internal injury in a 3-year-old body. Tamati's stomach and intestines were damaged. He experienced internal hemorrhaging. He suffered. And then he died, far from his biological family, in a home that was supposed to be his refuge. Investigators trust the pathologist and follow the medical evidence. The story of a mundane household fall, downstairs, off furniture, the usual explanations, does not fit the pattern and severity of internal trauma documented at autopsy. Forensic pathologists explain that the force required to cause these injuries is inconsistent with accidental household events involving a 3-year-old. Medical testimony and detailed forensic reports establish that blunt force, not accident, killed Tamati. Police arrest Michael Waterhouse and charge him with murder, the highest charge available under New Zealand law. The case goes to trial in the High Court. In 2003, a New Zealand jury convicts Michael Waterhouse of manslaughter rather than murder, finding that while he caused the death through an unlawful act, the prosecution did not prove beyond reasonable doubt that he intended to kill or cause injury he knew was likely to cause death. The distinction matters legally, but provides little comfort to Tamati's family. The court imposes a sentence of 10 years imprisonment with a non-parole period of 6 years. Justice Graham Lang's sentencing remarks focus on the fundamental breach of trust. A foster parent is entrusted with a child's safety and well-being, and Waterhouse violated that trust in the most final way possible. There are no dramatic courtroom outbursts to report. No sensational confessions, just the weight of a community's disappointment and a family's unbearable grief. Waterhouse serves his sentence in New Zealand's prison system. After satisfying the minimum non-parole period and additional time, he is eventually released back into the community under standard parole conditions. The cultural legacy is less about media dramatization. New Zealand tends toward less sensational crime coverage than the United States, and more about policy revision. Child, Youth and Family conducts extensive internal reviews. Reforms include caseload analysis, showing workers are stretched too thin, training protocols around recognizing household stress and intervening before crisis, and clearer red flag response systems designed to intervene earlier when foster parents show signs of being overwhelmed. Tamati's death becomes a case study in what happens when oversight fails and support is inadequate. What breaks first in these homes? The rules or the patience? In Huntley, in 2003, patience shattered and the child died while rules existed only on paper. The question New Zealand grapples with: how many near misses happen before each fatality, and could earlier intervention save lives? In 1945, Britain, the rules themselves had not yet been written clearly enough. Oversight was a suggestion rather than a requirement, and 2, Boys paid the price on a Shropshire farm where cruelty masqueraded as discipline.
Better answer him, woman.
It's true. I did. I sought a separation order. A year into our marriage.
A boy named Dennis O'Neill dies on a remote farm in Shropshire, England, in January 1945. He is 12 years old. His heart fails after repeated beatings to the chest and prolonged malnutrition that left his body unable to sustain the trauma. His younger brother, Terence, survives, but barely. He is found emaciated, covered in sores, bearing the marks of systematic abuse. The foster parents, Reginald and Esther Goff, stand in a dock that will bend British child protection law toward modernity. The case becomes a national scandal that forces Parliament to act, reshaping how Britain protects its most vulnerable children. Reginald and Esther Goff are not notable people before they receive the O'Neill brothers through the wartime boarding out system. They are farmers in rural Shropshire, approved to take evacuated or displaced children. Afterward, their names become shorthand for everything wrong with weak inspection regimes, rural isolation hiding abuse, and the dangers of assuming respectability equals safety. Scope: 1 child killed, 1 sibling gravely abused and permanently traumatized. Bank Farm, Minsterley, Shropshire, United Kingdom, 1944 into early January 1945. Notoriety: the subsequent Monckton inquiry, led by Sir Walter Monckton, produces a report that becomes the foundation for the Children Act 1948, which revolutionizes British child welfare by creating local authority children's departments, mandatory inspection protocols, and accountability structures. Background matters here because the system predates modern standards and operates under assumptions that seem almost medieval in retrospect. Under the 1930s, poor law framework still in effect during wartime, children from urban industrial areas are boarded out to rural homes with minimal oversight. The theory is that country air and farm work will benefit city children. The reality in cases like the O'Neills is forced labor and abuse. Dennis and Terence O'Neill are removed from their parents due to neglect and poverty and placed with the Goffs in June 1944. Checks are infrequent. An inspector might visit once every few months. Medical examinations are cursory or non-existent. Under the Goff's roof, early signs that should trigger intervention include visible weight loss that neighbors notice, marks and bruises that would be obvious to any trained observer, and the boy's fearful demeanor. But in rural 1940s England, deference to respectable farming families means inspectors accept excuses and don't look closely. The path to Dennis's death is prolonged neglect, punctuated by escalating physical violence, beatings with sticks, being forced to work outdoors in inadequate clothing during winter, food withheld as punishment. The crimes stretch across months, a slow-motion nightmare for 2 boys far from anyone who might help them. Confirmed deaths: 1. Method: repeated beatings leading to cardiac failure in a severely malnourished child. The post-mortem examination reveals ulceration, extreme emaciation with ribs and bones visible, and traumatic injuries to the chest consistent with being struck repeatedly. Modus operandi: cruelty masked by geographic distance and a culture of social deference that kept inspectors and authorities away from respectable rural households. Pattern: isolation of the victims from anyone who might report the abuse, intimidation that kept the boys silent during the rare visits when officials did appear. Reginald Goff is the primary abuser. Esther participates through neglect and failure to protect. Evasion is passive rather than active. No one looks closely enough, so nothing is seen until Dennis collapses on January 9th, 1945. The most disturbing element is systemic complicity through bureaucratic absence. The state placed the boys and then failed to follow up with meaningful oversight, medical checks, or unannounced visits. The Goffs did not need to be clever or careful because no one was watching. The investigation begins when Dennis O'Neill's death certificate reaches officials who refuse to stay quiet and accept easy explanations. Dr. A.K. Grant, who examines the body, is shocked by the condition and immediately reports his concerns. Local outrage amplifies as details emerge. The Home Office responds to public pressure by appointing Sir Walter Monckton KC to lead a public inquiry. The Monckton Report, delivered later in 1945, is devastating in its findings. It names systemic failures at every layer: inadequate inspection frequencies and quality, poor record keeping that left children invisible in the system, lack of medical follow-up that would have detected malnutrition, and the dangerous assumption that rural placements were inherently safer than urban institutions. The report's recommendations are comprehensive and form the blueprint for modern British child protection. In court, Reginald Gough is convicted of manslaughter. The jury finds he caused Dennis's death through unlawful violence but does not convict on murder. He is sentenced to 6 years of hard labor, a significant sentence for the time. Esther Gough is convicted of neglect for her failure to protect the children or seek medical care. Her sentence is lighter. The legal proceedings are straightforward. The real drama is in the policy response. The Goughs serve their time in obscurity and are released. What happens to them afterward is largely lost to history. They fade from public view, their names remembered only in the context of the case. The final legacy is not personal. It's statutory and profound. The Children Act 1948 emerges directly from the O'Neill case and the Monckton Report's recommendations. The Act creates local authority children's departments with trained staff, mandates regular inspections of all placements, requires medical examinations and record keeping, and establishes clear lines of accountability. It is the foundation of modern British child protection. The philosophical close writes itself. A 12-year-old boy's battered body forced a nation to draw lines it had not drawn before, to create structures where only informal practice existed, to accept that good intentions without oversight enable evil. Dennis O'Neill's death becomes the catalyst that saves countless future children. His name is memorialized not in a monument, but in law. We move forward in time and across the Atlantic to California, where licensing and background checks exist, but prove insufficient against a predator who uses foster care as a hunting ground.
When Barker became a full-time, flanked by an dressed in an orange jumpsuit, 36-year-old Kevin Barker appeared in court for the first time. Flanked by an attorney, Barker...
Not all harm ends in homicide, but the damage can last lifetimes. In Sacramento County, California, the district attorney's office uses language the public needs to hear when announcing a conviction and sentence: a serial child molester who abused a position of trust. The former foster parent is Kevin Michael Barker. The crimes span roughly a decade, maybe longer. The victims are multiple and include some who were placed in his care by Sacramento County. The prosecution concludes in late 2024 with a sentence specifically designed to keep him in prison for the rest of his natural life. Kevin Barker's public persona is carefully constructed: a licensed foster caregiver who passes state-mandated background checks, completes required training, and hosts vulnerable children in his Sacramento area home. He appears on paperwork as a community resource, someone stepping up to help kids in need. In private, he is a predator who grooms, manipulates, films, and sexually assaults minors. Scope: multiple victims over approximately 10 years from around 2008 into 2018, including foster youth placed in his care and other minors he had access to. Sacramento County, California, prosecution and sentencing in 2024. Notoriety: a district attorney press release that names the institutional betrayal in stark terms, extensive media coverage emphasizing the abuse of trust element, and a sentence structured as 30 years to life that ensures Barker will die in prison. Barker's own childhood and early history are irrelevant to the case facts and are not detailed in public court documents. The focus remains on his crimes and victims. The relevant background is the licensing pipeline that granted him access to vulnerable minors, state approval to become a foster parent, background checks that he passed, raising questions about what those checks actually screened for, and home inspections that found his residence suitable. early warning signs appear only in hindsight and through victim testimony. Privacy demands around certain rooms in the house, restrictions on when social workers could make unannounced visits, and later, after investigation begins, the discovery of digital evidence showing a long-term pattern of predation. The formative factor enabling the crimes is opportunity. Foster licensing provided a renewable stream of isolated, traumatized children with limited external support networks, children who had already learned not to trust authority figures. The crimes blend systematic grooming with modern technology in ways that make prosecution both easier, digital evidence, and more disturbing, permanence of images. Confirmed victims, several, named in charging documents filed in Sacramento County Superior Court. Suspected victims, potentially more, as is tragically common in long-running child sexual abuse cases where shame, fear, and trauma prevent many victims from ever coming forward. Method: grooming through false trust and manipulation of the caregiver. Role: coercion, including threats and emotional manipulation, hidden camera recordings that violated victims' privacy and created permanent records of abuse and sexual assault ranging from inappropriate touching to rape. Modus operandi: exploit the caregiver role to isolate victims and normalize boundary violations. Use the victim's vulnerability and system involvement against them. No one will believe you, you'll just be moved again. And create digital documentation that serves both as criminal evidence and as additional leverage over victims. Pattern: repeated access to minors under the protective color of state authority and community trust. Evasion tactics rely on secrecy enforced through shame and threats, and the victim's inherent vulnerability within the foster system. The most disturbing aspect is structural. Abuse occurring under a government license specifically designed to protect children from harm, enabled by a system that provided access and then failed to adequately monitor what happened behind closed doors. The investigation begins not through routine oversight, but through external reporting, a tip from a neighbor who observed suspicious behavior or images. An Internet Crimes Against Children (ICAC) task force, a multi-agency collaboration that investigates online child exploitation, secures a search warrant for Barker's home and digital devices. The execution of that warrant changes everything. Seized computers, hard drives, cameras, and storage devices tell the truth in explicit, undeniable digital detail. Forensic analysis reveals hundreds or thousands of images and videos documenting years of sexual abuse. Victim interviews follow as investigators identify children who were in Barker's care. The courage of survivors who come forward, despite trauma and shame, is what ultimately breaks the case wide open. Arrest follows swiftly once evidence is compiled. In late 2024, Kevin Michael Barker enters no contest pleas to multiple counts of sexual abuse involving minors, including charges specific to foster children in his care. The decision to enter no contest pleas rather than go to trial spares victims from having to testify and relive their trauma in court, but it also means Barker does not formally admit guilt. He simply accepts that the evidence against him is sufficient for conviction. The Sacramento County Superior Court sentences him to 30 years to life in state prison. Under California law, this means he must serve a minimum of 30 years before becoming eligible for parole consideration, and given the nature of his crimes and the likelihood of denial, he will almost certainly die in custody. The courtroom moment that matters most is not a dramatic confession or victim confrontation, but the prosecutorial statement released to media and public. Former foster parent sentenced to 30 to life for sexually assaulting multiple children. The language is institutional, but the message is clear. A betrayal of the highest order has been punished. Barker enters the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation to serve his sentence. As of November 2025, he remains incarcerated. The legacy of the case is multifaceted. Stark caution to licensing bodies nationwide that background checks are baseline screening tools, not guarantees of safety. evidence that ongoing unannounced visits and external reporting channels independent of the placement agency remain essential, and testimony to the importance of believing children when they disclose abuse. The survivor's courage in coming forward despite trauma, shame, and fear is what broke the case open and prevented Barker from harming additional children. What is the opposite of rescue? When survivors of one nightmare are placed into another and harmed again, the system's promise of safety becomes not just broken, but obscene. The betrayal is compounded. We moved to Riverside County, California, 2018 into 2021, where some of the Turpin siblings, whose rescue from a house of horrors dominated international headlines in 2018, encounter new abuse in foster care, proving that visibility and public concern do not automatically translate to safety.
Admitting to 7 counts of lewd acts on a minor, inflicting injury on a child, and false imprisonment. His wife and adult daughter sentenced to 4 years.
The names are Marcelino Olgan, Rosa Maria Olgan, and a relative named Lenis Olgan. The household operates as licensed foster caregivers in Riverside County. The phrase used by prosecutors after sentencing in 2024 is carefully calibrated but clear. A step toward justice for the victims. The case involves multiple foster youth placed over several years, but public and media attention focuses intensely on 2018 through 2021 because some of the victims are Turpin siblings, young adults who survived David and Louise Turpin's house where 13 children were starved, chained, and tortured for years. The Olgans present to the world and to Riverside County officials as experienced caregivers capable of handling traumatized youth with complex needs. The county is under enormous pressure. In early 2018, the Turpin Rescue places 13 siblings, ranging from small children to young adults, into a system already strained beyond capacity. Finding placements that can accommodate sibling groups with severe trauma is nearly impossible. The Olgans appear to be part of the solution. In private, allegations surface, later substantiated through guilty pleas and civil litigation, of physical abuse, sexual abuse, and financial exploitation of foster youth, including some of the adult Turpin siblings placed in their care. Scope: multiple foster youth placed over several years in Riverside County, California, with the most intense public attention focused on 2018 through 2021 when Turpin survivors are in the home. Notoriety: international media coverage because the world assumed the Turpin rescue was the end of those children's suffering, only to learn through investigative reporting and lawsuits that some were re-victimized in the very homes meant to provide healing and safety. The case becomes a symbol of systemic failure compounded. Background detail on the Olgan family members themselves is less important than the institutional context. Riverside County, under intense scrutiny and pressure to place the Turpin siblings quickly, a foster care system already operating beyond capacity, and the challenges of vetting homes for adults with developmental delays and severe trauma. Early warning signs include complaints from some foster youth that are documented but not acted upon with sufficient urgency, and red flags that the volume of crisis cases and staff turnover obscure rather than illuminate. The path to harm is incremental and tragically familiar. Initial placement, trust-building phase where the caregivers appear supportive, then boundary violations that escalate when the Olgans realize the victims are unlikely to be believed, have been conditioned not to report abuse or are too ashamed and traumatized to disclose. The crimes are plural, prolonged, and constitute a profound betrayal of already traumatized individuals. Confirmed convictions, child cruelty offenses to which the Olgans pled guilty, allegations substantiated through legal proceedings. And civil litigation include physical abuse such as hitting and confinement, sexual abuse of vulnerable adults who were legally considered dependent adults due to developmental delays, and financial exploitation including theft of benefit payments meant for the foster youth. Method: targeting the exact psychological vulnerabilities, profound mistrust of authority figures, shame and self-blame internalized from prior abuse, trauma bonding, fear of being disbelieved or moved again. that the state promised to address through therapeutic placement. Pattern: using the caregiving role to isolate victims from potential supporters, control their finances and movements, and maintain power through fear and manipulation. The most disturbing aspect is moral rather than purely methodological, a second victimization of individuals the world watched being saved. Proof that visibility and public concern do not automatically translate to safety when systemic capacity is inadequate. Investigations include intense media scrutiny led by reporters who stayed with the Turpin story, civil lawsuits filed by adult Turpin siblings seeking accountability and damages, and criminal filings by the Riverside County District Attorney's Office. Evidence mounts through victim testimony, financial records, and investigative work. Guilty pleas follow in 2024, avoiding trials that would have re-traumatized victims but delivering some measure of accountability. In 2024, Marcelino Olgan is sentenced to 7 years in state prison on charges of child cruelty. Rosa Maria Olgan and Lenny's Olgan each receive probation rather than prison time, a sentencing outcome that strikes many victim advocates and observers as grossly insufficient given the scope and nature of harm inflicted. The sentences represent the negotiated resolution of plea agreements and judicial discretion within statutory limits. There is no grand courtroom confrontation to quote, "No dramatic victim impact moment captured for television, just prosecutors' measured statements about accountability being achieved within the constraints of the criminal justice system." As of November 2025, Marcelino Olgan serves his sentence in California's prison system. Rosa Maria and Lenny's Olgan complete or are completing probation terms. The legacy is systemic critique and ongoing advocacy, speed prioritized over safety and placement decisions, insufficient vetting of homes designated for high need or high vulnerability placements, and the bitter, shameful irony that a global rescue story contained a hidden second chapter of harm enabled by the very system meant to provide sanctuary. Civil litigation by Turpin survivors against Riverside County seeks not just compensation, but policy change, better training, lower caseloads, trauma-informed placement matching, unannounced visits, and independent advocates for adults with developmental delays. The question we transition with is devastatingly simple. What good is escape if the landing site is unsafe? When rescue leads to re-victimization, every promise made rings hollow. We move to northern Indiana, spring 2024, where a 10-year-old boy's final plea for safety goes unheard and the foster mother's discipline becomes a death sentence.
Foster mother to prison for causing his death.
We are pretty happy with the results. It doesn't bring him back, but it's a start.
49-year-old Jennifer Wilson was immediately taken into
Northern Indiana, spring 2024. A 10-year-old boy named Dakota Levi Stevens approaches a neighbor with a request that breaks the heart. "Please adopt me," he begs. The plea comes in the days or weeks before he returns for the last time to a foster home in Valparaiso, Porter County, where a woman named Jennifer Lee Wilson will use her body weight as punishment for a minor behavioral issue. A camera inside the home, installed for monitoring or security purposes, records what happens next in horrifying detail. The child screams. The restraint continues for approximately 5 minutes. Dakota stops moving. The autopsy delivered by the Porter County coroner uses 2 clinical words that explain everything: mechanical asphyxia. In January 2025, a Porter County judge calls it reckless homicide and imposes the maximum sentence allowable under the negotiated plea agreement, 6 years, with 1 year suspended to probation, meaning 5 actual years in custody. The courtroom in Valparaiso is somber, packed with family members, advocates, and media. Dakota's grandmother speaks through tears of a child who loved dinosaurs, collected facts about prehistoric creatures, and wanted desperately to feel safe and wanted. The sentence triggers immediate public debate and outrage. Is 5 years in prison sufficient for a child's death? Victim advocates say no. The judge's hands are tied by the plea agreement. Jennifer Lee Wilson is not a veteran foster parent with years of placements. She is relatively new to the role and, by multiple accounts from family and officials, overwhelmed by the challenges of caring for a child with behavioral and emotional needs stemming from prior trauma. That context does not mitigate what follows. It provides explanation but not excuse, background but not justification. Scope: one child, Valparaiso area, Porter County, Indiana, April 2024. Notoriety: the existence of in-home surveillance video that captured the fatal restraint in real time, and a sentence that many victim advocates, child welfare experts, and members of the public consider grossly inadequate for taking a child's life. Background details on Jennifer Lee Wilson are limited in public court records and media coverage. She is a local woman who becomes licensed as a foster parent, passes required checks and training, and receives placement of Dakota. The relevant early sign that should have triggered intervention is Dakota's own attempt to escape the placement. His plea to a neighbor reveals a child in acute distress, a child who feels unsafe, a child intuitive enough to know he needs rescue. That information apparently does not reach caseworkers in time or is not acted upon with the urgency it deserves. The path to the fatal moment is a sequence of escalating discipline practices that culminate in prone restraint, a technique explicitly warned against in foster care training protocols nationwide because of its known danger. The crime itself lasts only minutes but changes. Everything forever. Confirmed victims: 1. Method: prone restraint with the adult's full body weight applied to the child's back for approximately 5 minutes while Dakota screams for help, begs Wilson to stop, and eventually falls silent. Modus operandi: physical control deployed as punishment for a behavioral issue. Sources indicate Dakota may have been acting out or refusing to comply with instructions. Pattern: video evidence reviewed by investigators suggests this was not the first time restraint techniques were used in the Wilson home, but it was the first time the restraint proved fatal. The most disturbing aspect is the immediacy and the documentation. The surveillance footage, later reviewed by law enforcement and presented in summary form to the court, captures the child's distress in real time. You can hear the danger, you can hear Dakota begging, and it continues anyway until silence. Detectives obtain the video evidence quickly after Dakota's death and secure autopsy results from the Porter County coroner. The medical examiner's conclusion is medically and legally unambiguous: mechanical asphyxia caused by prone restraint with body weight compression. The manner of death is homicide. A warrant is issued for Wilson's arrest. She is initially considered missing. There's a brief period where her location is unknown and authorities search for her. She is located and arrested. Initial charges are severe: murder, neglect of a dependent resulting in death, and battery resulting in death. In October 2024, Jennifer Lee Wilson enters into a negotiated plea agreement with prosecutors. She pleads guilty to a reduced charge of reckless homicide, avoiding trial and the possibility of a much longer sentence, but accepting criminal responsibility for Dakota's death. On January 17, 2025, Porter Superior Court Judge Michael Bergeson conducts the sentencing hearing. Dakota's family members provide victim impact statements. The judge sentences Wilson to the maximum term allowable under the plea parameters, 6 years, with 1 year suspended to probation, resulting in 5 years of actual incarceration in the Indiana Department of Correction. Judge Bergeson's remarks emphasize the tragic loss of a young life and the need for accountability, even as some courtroom observers and advocates note aloud that 5 years feels grotesquely incommensurate with a child's death. Jennifer Lee Wilson enters the Indiana Department of Correction to serve her sentence. As of November 2025, she remains incarcerated. The legacy is renewed advocacy and policy pressure for absolute bans on bodyweight restraint techniques in any home, foster, adoptive, biological, or institutional, that cares for children. Child welfare organizations and medical professionals point to Dakota's case as proof that training is insufficient if enforcement and accountability are weak. The policy question is technical but urgent when training explicitly warns against a technique and a caregiver uses it anyway with fatal results. Which failed first? The instruction, the oversight, or the conscience? All three, advocates argue, and all three need systemic repair. We close our compilation with a Canadian case where a judge, delivering findings from a mandated fatality inquiry, speaks with rare and commendable bluntness about systemic collapse at every level.
Today, the second trial ended the same way as the first.
Lily Choi had hoped this time the decision would be different. The former foster mom on trial for a second time.
The death of Kauliga Potts was a direct result of the fundamental failure of everyone connected with this child to do their jobs. The words come from Justice Peter Ayotte during the conclusion of a fatality inquiry mandated under Alberta law. The 3-year-old boy's name is Kauliga Potts, sometimes spelled Kaliga in early media reports. The foster mother's name is Lily Choi, also reported in some legal documents as Lily. The city is Edmonton, Alberta's capital. The date of Kauliga's death is July 29, 2007. The head injuries documented at autopsy are catastrophic, blunt force trauma to the skull and brain, inconsistent with any accidental explanation offered by the caregiver. A manslaughter conviction follows in 2011 after trial. Appeals are filed and fail at multiple levels. The sentence, after judicial adjustments through the appellate process, stands at 8 years in federal custody. Lily Choi's public profile before the crime is minimal and unremarkable. A licensed foster caregiver operating within Edmonton's busy urban child welfare system during a period of high demand and strained resources. Neighbors later describe her as quiet, private, not particularly social. In private, the 3-year-old child placed in her care dies of traumatic head injury that medical examiners conclude could only result from violent force. Scope: 1 child, Edmonton, Alberta, July 2007. Notoriety: a fatality inquiry that names systemic failure in language so direct and damning it becomes a rallying cry for reform advocates across Canada. Justice Ayotte's statement that everyone connected with this child failed to do their jobs is quoted repeatedly in legislative hearings and policy debates. Biographical details on Lily Choi are sparse in public sources and media archives. The relevant background is not her personal history, but the institutional context, the pace of placements in a city struggling with poverty and family breakdown, the adequacy of oversight when caseloads are unsustainable, the follow-up protocols that existed on paper but faltered in practice due to resource constraints and human error. Early warning signs identified during the fatality inquiry include missed scheduled visits by social workers who were supposed to check on Kauliga's well-being, insufficient documentation of the child's condition and development in the weeks and months before his death, and potential concerns raised but not escalated. The path to the crime is a sequence of missed opportunities for intervention that Justice Ayotte later catalogues in painstaking detail in his inquiry report. Visits that should have happened but didn't. Reports that should have been filed but weren't. Concerns that should have triggered action but were lost in the chaos of an overwhelmed system. The crime is medical, mortal, and in retrospect preventable. Confirmed victims: 1. Method: blunt force head trauma sufficient to cause skull fracture and catastrophic brain injury. The injuries, documented at autopsy and explained by forensic pathologists, cannot be reconciled with the household accident narratives initially offered. No fall from furniture, no tumble downstairs, no rough play with siblings can produce this pattern of injury. Pattern across the investigation. Inconsistent and shifting explanations from the caregiver about what happened. Stories that don't align with the medical evidence or the timeline. The most disturbing aspect is preventability. Justice Ayotte's language in the fatality inquiry makes devastatingly clear that multiple professionals across multiple agencies fail to perform basic duties outlined in policy and procedure, and the 3-year-old boy paid with his life. Indigenous advocates note that Kauliga was Indigenous. part of a broader pattern of indigenous children being disproportionately removed from families and placed in non-indigenous care where outcomes are often poor. Investigators rely on pediatric forensic pathology, detailed timeline reconstruction, and witness interviews. The medical evidence systematically contradicts the explanations offered for Kauliga's injuries. Charges are filed against Lily Choi. In 2011, an Alberta Court of Queen's Bench, now Court of King's Bench, jury convicts Choi of manslaughter in the death of Kauliga Potts after hearing medical testimony and evidence. Sentencing is complicated by legal factors and judicial discretion. The initial sentence is 6 years. The Crown appeals, arguing the sentence is demonstrably unfit given the severity of the crime and the breach of trust. The Alberta Court of Appeal agrees and adjusts the sentence upwards to 8 years in federal custody. The appellate history leaves the conviction intact. No successful appeal on the merits of guilt. Lily Choi serves her 8-year sentence in a federal facility. Upon completion of the sentence, she is released. Her current whereabouts and status are not matters of public record. The legacy remains embedded in Alberta's policy files, media archives, and the collective memory of child welfare advocates. Indigenous children are disproportionately represented in care due to systemic racism and poverty. Oversight quality varies dramatically depending on caseload levels and available resources. Fatality inquiries, while valuable for identifying failures, must trigger binding action plans with measurable outcomes and accountability, not merely non-binding recommendations that gather dust. Justice. IOTA's Fatality Inquiry Report includes dozens of recommendations aimed at preventing future deaths. Some are implemented. Others face resistance due to cost or bureaucratic inertia. Kauliga's death, like Dakota's and Logan's and Marcus's and all the others, should have been the catalyst for fundamental change. Whether it was depends on metrics advocates continue to track: caseload sizes, frequency of unannounced visits, time to intervention when concerns are raised, placement stability, and ultimately, the number of children who die in care. What do these 10 cases share across borders, across decades, across legal systems? None involve biological kin taking children back into family care. All involve state or provincial or national approval, licensing processes, vetting procedures, background checks, monitoring systems, paperwork conferred trust and legal authority, practice betrayed it utterly. The money exists, it's a question of priorities. The political will is harder because child welfare is invisible until it fails catastrophically, and even then, the attention fades. These 10 cases represent a fraction of children who die or are harmed in placements meant to save them. The children in these stories did not have voices loud enough to save them. We can be that voice now. We can demand the accountability their deaths should have triggered. We can refuse to accept that this is simply the price of an imperfect system. These were failures, human failures, institutional failures, systemic failures, and failures can be corrected if we have the will. If you found this exploration into these shocking cases compelling, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Which of these killers or abusers do you think was the most disturbing? Share your thoughts in the comments below.